Today we're going to do page 42 to 60. At twilight, once the sun had slid behind the Palin Mountains, the Batskay Mountains rolled through the sky above the shacks of Midland. The old lady who lived next door warned us away from bats. She called them flying rats and said one got caught in her hair once and went crazy clawing at her scalp. But I loved those ugly little bats. The way they had darted past their wings in a furious blur. Dad explains how they had sonar detectors, kind of like the ones in nuclear submarines. Brian and I would throw pebbles, hoping the bats would think they were bugs and eat them, and the weight of the pebbles would pull them down, and we could keep them as pets, tying a long string to their claw so they could still fly around. I wanted to train one to hang upside down from my finger, but those darn bats were too clever to fall for our trick. The bats were out, swooping and screeching, when we left Midland for Blythe. Earlier that day, Mom had told us that the baby had decided it was big enough to come out soon and join the family. Once we were on the road, Dad and Mom got in a big fight over how many months she had been pregnant. Mom said she was 10 months pregnant. Dad, who had fixed someone's transmission earlier that day, had used the money he'd made to buy a bottle of tequila and said she probably lost track somewhere. I always carry children longer than most women, Mom said. Lori was in my womb for 14 months. Bullshit, Dad said. Unless Lori's part elephant. Don't you make fun of me for me or my children, Mom yelled. Some babies are premature. Mine were all post-mature, and that's why they're so smart. Their brains had longer to develop. Dad said something about freaks of nature, and Mom called Dad a Mr. Know-It-All Smarty-Pants who refused to believe that she was special. Dad said something about Jesus H. Christ on a goddamn crutch, not taking that much time to gestate. Mom got upset at Dad's blasphemy, reached her foot over to the driver's side, and stomped on the brake. It was the middle of the night, and Mom bolted out of the car and ran into the darkness. "You crazy bitch," Dad yelled. "Get your goddamn ass back in this car." "You make me, Mr. Tough Guy," she screamed as she ran away. Dad jerked the steering wheel to one side and drove off the road into the desert after her. Lori and Brian and I braced one another in our arms, like we always did when Dad went on some other wild chase that we knew would get bumpy. Dad stuck his head out of the window as he drove, hollering at Mom, calling her a stupid whore and a stinking cunt, and ordering her to get back in the car. She refused. She was ahead of us, bobbing in and out of the desert brush. Since she had never used curse words, she was calling Dad names like blankety blank and worthless drunk and so. Dad stopped the car and then jammed down the accelerator and popped the clutch. We shot forward toward Mom, who screamed and jumped out of the way. Dad turned around and went for her again. It was a moonless night, so we couldn't see Mom except when she ran into the beam of the headlights. We kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide like a hunted animal's. We kids cried and begged Dad to stop, but he ignored us. I was even more worried about the baby inside Mom's swollen belly than I was about her. The car bounced on holes and rocks, brush scratching against its side, and dust coming up through the open windows. Finally, Dad cornered Mom against some rocks. I was afraid he might smush her with the car, but instead he got out and dragged her back, legs flailing, and he threw her into the car. We banged back, though, through the desert and onto the road. Everyone was quiet except for Mom, who was sobbing that she really did carry Lori for 14 months. Mom and Dad made up the next day, and by late afternoon, Mom was cutting Dad's hair in the living room of the apartment we'd rented in Blythe. He'd taken off his shirt and was sitting backward on a chair with his head bowed and his hair combed forward. Mom was snipping away while Dad pointed out the parts that were still too long. When they were finished, Dad combed his hair back and announced that Mom had done a hell of a fine shearing job. Our apartment was a one-story cinder block building on the outskirts of town. It had a big blue and white plastic sign in the shape of an oval and a boomerang that said the LBJ Apartments. I thought it stood for Lori, Brian, and Jeanette, but Mom said LBJ were the initials of the president who, she added, was a crook and a warmonger. A few truck drivers and cowboys had rooms at the LBJ Apartments, but most of the other people who lived there were migrant workers and their families, and we heard them talking through the thin sheetrock walls. Mom said it was one of the bonuses of living in the LBJ Apartments, because we'd be able to pick up a little Spanish without even studying. Blythe was in California, but the Arizona border was within spitting distance. People who lived here liked to say that the town was 150 miles west of Phoenix, 250 miles east of Los Angeles, and smack dab in the middle of nowhere. But they'd always said it like they were bragging. Mom and Dad weren't exactly crazy about Blythe. Too civilized, they said, and downright unnatural, too, since no town the size of Blythe had any business existing out of the Mojave Desert. It was near the Colorado River, founded back in the 19th century by some guy who had figured out he could get rich by turning the desert into farmland. He dug a bunch of irrigation ditches and drained water out of the Colorado River to grow lettuce and grapes and broccoli right there in the middle of the cactus and sagebrush. Dad got disgusted every time we drove past one of those farm fields with their irrigation ditches wide as moats. "It's a goddamn perversion of nature," he'd say. "If you want to live in the farmland, haul your sorry hide off to Pennsylvania. If you want to live in the desert, eat prickly pears, not iceberg pansy-ass lettuce." "That's right," Mom would say. "Prickly pears have more vitamins anyways." Living in the big city, like Blythe, meant I had to wear shoes. It also meant I had to go to school. School wasn't so bad. I was in the first grade, and my teacher, Miss Cook, always chose me to read aloud when the principal came into the classroom. The other students didn't like me very much because I was so tall and pale and skinny, and raised my hands too fast and waved it frantically into the air whenever Miss Cook asked a question. A few days after I started school, 4 Mexican girls followed me home and jumped me in an alleyway near the LBJ apartments. They beat me up pretty bad, pulling my hair and tearing my clothes and calling me a teacher's pet and a matchstick. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. "Looks to me like you got in a fight," Dad said. He was sitting at the table, taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. "Just a little dust-up," I said. That was the word Dad always used after he had been in a fight. "How many were there?" "6, I lied. "Is that split lip okay?" he asked. "This little scratch?" I asked. "You should have seen what I did to them." "That's my girl," Dad said, and went back to the clock. But Brian kept looking over at me. The next day, when I got to the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair. That fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori, and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. "Just back off now, and everyone can walk away with all their limbs still attached." Brian said. It was another one of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls stared at him before bursting into laughter. Then they surrounded him. Brian did fairly well fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared beneath a flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and hit one of the girls in the head with it. From the jolt to my arm, I thought he cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me on the ground and kicked me in the face. They all ran off, and the girl I had hit, holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple spots of blood seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain-link fence he had discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves and eventually settled down to a feast, burying our faces in the huge wet heads of lettuce and eating till our stomachs ached. "I guess we scared him off pretty good," I said to Brian. "I guess," he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud that he had taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. "Lettuce war," Brian shouted. He tossed a half-eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved as it made pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane. A fine white powder came sprinkling down on our heads. 2 months after we moved to Blythe, when Mom said she was 12 months pregnant, she at last gave birth. After she'd been in the hospital for 2 days, we all drove out to pick her up. Dad left us kids waiting in the car with the engine idling while he went in for Mom. They came running out in Dad's arm, with Dad's arms around Mom's shoulders. Mom was cradling a bundle in her arms and giggling sort of guiltily, like she'd stolen a candy bar from a dime store. I figured they'd checked out Rex Wallace style. "What is it?" Lori asked, as we sped away. "Girl," Mom said. She handed me the baby. I was going to turn 6 in a few months, and Mom said I was mature enough to hold her for the entire way home. The baby was pink and wrinkly, but absolutely beautiful, with big blue eyes and soft wisps of blonde hair, and the tiniest fingernails I had ever seen. She moved in confused, jerky motions, as if she couldn't understand why Mom's belly wasn't still around her. I promised her that I'd always take care of her. The baby went without a name for weeks. Mom said she wanted to study it first, the way she would the subject of a painting. We had a lot of arguments over what the name should be. I wanted to call her Rosita, after the prettiest girl in my class, but Mom said that name was too Mexican. I thought we weren't supposed to be prejudiced, I said. That's not being prejudiced, Mom said. It's a matter of accuracy and labeling. She told us that both of our grandmothers were angry because neither Lori or I had been named after them, so she decided to call the baby Lily Ruth Maureen. Lily was Mom's mother's name, and Irma Ruth was Dad's mother's name, but we'd call the baby Maureen, a name Mom liked because it was diminutive of Mary, so she'd also be naming the baby after herself, but pretty much no one would know it. That Dad told us, would make everyone happy except his mom, who hated the name Ruth and wanted the baby to be called Irma, and Mom's mom, who would hate sharing her namesake with Dad's mom. A few months after Maureen was born, a squad car tried to pull us over because the brake lights on the green caboose weren't working. Dad took off. He said that if the cops stopped us, they'd find out that we had no registration or insurance and that the license plate had been taken off another car, and they'd arrest us all. After barreling down the highway, he made a screeching U-turn with all of us kids feeling like the car was going to tumble over on its side. But the squad car made one too. Dad peeled through Blythe at 100 miles an hour, ran a red light, cut the wrong way up a one-way street. The other cars honking and pulling over, we made a few more turns, headed down an alley, and then found an empty garage to hide in. We heard the sound of a siren a couple blocks away, and then it faded. Dad said that since the Gestapo would have their eyes out for the green caboose, that we'd have to leave it in the garage and walk home. The next day, we'd announced that Blythe had become a little too hot and we were hitting the road again. This time, he knew where we were going. Dad had been doing some research and settled in a town in northern Nevada called Battle Mountain. There was gold in Battle Mountain, Dad said, and he intended to go after it with the prospector. Finally, we were going to strike it rich. Mom and Dad rented a great big U-Haul truck. Mom explained that since only she and Dad could fit in the front of the U-Haul, Lori, Brian, Maureen, and I were in for a treat. We got to ride in the back. It would be fun, she said, a real adventure, but there wouldn't be any light, so we would have to use all our resources to entertain one another. Plus, we were not allowed to talk. Since it was illegal to ride in the back, anyone who heard us might call the cops. Mom told us the trip would be about 14 hours if we took the highway, but we should tack on another couple of hours because we might take some scenic detours. We packed up what furniture we had, and there wasn't much, mostly parts for the prospector and a couple of chairs and Mom's old paintings and art supplies. When we were ready to leave, Mom wrapped Maureen in a lavender blanket and passed her to me, and we kids all climbed into the back of the U-Haul. Dad closed the doors. It was pitch black, and the air smelled stale and dusty. We were sitting on the ribbed wooden floor on frayed, stained blankets used to wrap furniture, feeling for one another with our hands. "Here goes the adventure," I whispered. "Shh," Lori said. The U-Haul started up and lurched forward. Maureen let loose with a loud, high-pitched wail. I shushed her and rocked her and patted her, but she kept crying. So I gave her to Lori, who whispered sing-songs under her ear and told jokes. That didn't work either, so we begged Maureen to please stop crying. And then we just put our hands over our ears. After a while, it got cold and uncomfortable in the back of the dark U-Haul. The engine made the floor vibrate, and we'd all go tumbling whenever we hit a bump. Several hours passed, and by then we were all dying to pee and wondering if Dad was going to pull over for a rest stop. Suddenly, with a bang, we hit a huge pothole, and the back doors on the U-Haul flew open. The wind shrieked through the compartment. We were afraid we were going to get sucked out, so we all shrank back against the prospector. The moon was out, and we could see the glow through the silvery desert. The unlocked doors swung back and forth with loud clanks. Since the furniture was stored between us and the cabin, we couldn't knock on the wall to get Mom and Dad's attention. We banged on the side of the U-Haul and hollered as loud as we could, but the engine was too noisy and they didn't hear us. Brian called into the back of the van. When one of the doors swung, he grabbed it, but it flew open again, jerking him forward. I thought the door was going to drag Brian out, but he jumped back just in time. and scrambled along the wooden floor towards Lori and me. Brian and Lori held tight to the prospector, which Dad had tied securely with ropes. I was holding Maureen, who for some strange reason had stopped crying. I wedged myself into a corner, which seemed like we'd have to ride it out. Then a pair of headlights appeared way in the distance behind us. We watched the car slowly pull up to the U-Haul. After a few minutes, it pulled right up behind us. Its headlights caught us there in the back of the cab. The car started honking and flashing its brights, and then pulled up and passed us. The driver must have signaled Mom and Dad because the U-Haul slowly stopped, and Dad came running back with the flashlight. "What the hell's going on?" he asked. He was furious. We tried to explain that it wasn't our fault and the doors blew open, but he was still angry. I knew that he was scared, maybe even more scared than angry. "Was that a cop?" Brian asked. "No, but you're sure as hell lucky it wasn't, or he'd be hauling your asses off to jail." After we peed, we climbed back into the truck and watched as Dad closed the doors. The darkness enveloped us again. We could hear Dad locking the doors and double-checking them. The engine restarted, and we continued on our way. Battle Mountain had started out as a mining post, settled 100 years earlier by the people hoping to strike it rich. But if anyone had ever struck it rich in Battle Mountain, they must have moved somewhere else to spend their fortune. Nothing about the town was grand except for the big empty sky, and off in the distance the stony purple Tuscarora Mountains, running down into a table-flat desert. The main street was wide, and the sun-bleached cars and pickup trucks parked at an angle to the curb, but only a few blocks long, flanked on both sides with low, flat-roofed buildings made of adobe or brick. A single streetlight flashed red day and night. Along Main Street was a grocery store, a drugstore, a Ford dealership, a Greyhound bus station, and 2 big casinos, the Owl Club and the Nevada Hotel. The buildings, which seemed puny under the huge sky, had neon signs that didn't look like they were on during the day because the sun was so bright. We moved into a wooden building on the edge of town that had once been a railroad depot. It was 2 stories tall and painted in industrial green that was so close to the railroad tracks that you could wave to the engineer from the front window. Our new home was one of the oldest buildings in town, Mom proudly told us, with real frontier quality to it. Mom and Dad's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, where the station manager once had his office. We kids slept downstairs in what had been the waiting room. The old restrooms were still here, but the toilet had been ripped out of one and the bathtub put in its place. The ticket booth had been converted into a kitchen. Some of the original benches were still bolted to the unpainted wood walls, and you could see the dark, worn spots where the prospectors and miners and their wives and children had sat waiting for the train, their behinds polishing the wood. Since we didn't have money for furniture, we improvised. A bunch of huge wooden spools, and the kind that could hold an industrial cable, had been dumped on the side of the tracks not far from our house, so we rolled them home and turned them into tables. What kind of fools would go waste money on store-bought tables when they have these for free? Dad said as he pounded tops of the spools to show us how sturdy they were. For chairs, we had some smaller spools and a few crates instead of beds. And instead of beds, we kids slept in a big cardboard box, like the ones refrigerators got delivered in. A little while after we moved into the depot, we heard Mom and Dad talking about buying us kids real beds, and said they shouldn't do it. We said they shouldn't do it. We liked our boxes. They made going to bed seem like an adventure. Slowly after we moved into the depot, Mom decided that what we really needed was a piano. Dad found a cheap upright when a saloon in the next town over went out of business. He borrowed a neighbor's pickup to bring it home. We slid it off the pickup and down a ramp, but it was too heavy to carry. To get it to the depot, Dad devised the symptoms of ropes and pulleys that he attached to the piano in the front yard, and ran through the house out the back door. Where they were tied to the pickup, the plan was for Mom to ease the truck forward, pulling the piano into the house, while Dad and we kids guided it up the ramp of planks and through the front door. "Ready," Dad hollered when we were all in our positions. "Okie doke," Mom shouted, but instead of easing forward, Mom, who had never quite gotten the hang of driving, hit the gas pedal hard, and the truck shot ahead. The piano jerked out of our hands, sending us lurching forward, and bounced into the house, splintering the doorframe. Dad screamed at Mom to slow down, but she kept going, and dragging the screeching cord banging piano across the depot floor and right through the rear door, splintering its frame too, and then out into the backyard, where it came to a rest next to a thorny bush. Dad came running through the house. "What in the Sam Hill were you thinking? Or were you doing?" he yelled at Mom. "I told you to go slow." I was only doing 25, Mom said. You get mad at me when I go that slow on a highway. She looked behind her and saw the piano sit in the backyard. Oopsie daisy, she said. Mom wanted to turn around and drag it back into the house from the other direction, but Dad said that was impossible because the railroad tracks were too close to the front door to get the pickup in position. So the piano stayed where it was. On the days where Mom felt inspired, she took her sheet music and one of our spool chairs outside and pounded away at her music back there. Most pianists never get the chance to play in the great of outdoors, she said, and now the whole neighborhood can enjoy music too. Dad got a job as an electrician at a Barrett mine. He left early and came home early, and in the afternoons we all played games. Dad taught us cards. He tried to show us how to be steely-eyed poker players, but I wasn't very good. Dad said that you should read my face like a traffic light. Dad said you could read my face like a traffic light. Even though I wasn't much of a bluffer, I'd sometimes win a hand because I'd always get excited by even mediocre cards, like a pair of fives, which made Brian and Lori think that I had been dealt aces. Dad also invented games for us to play, like the Ergo game, in which he'd make statements of fact, which we had to answer a question based on the statements, or else say insufficient information to draw a conclusion and explain why. When Dad wasn't there, we invented our own games. We didn't have many toys, but you didn't need toys in a place like Battle Mountain. We'd get a piece of cardboard and go tobogganing down the depot's narrow staircase. We'd jump off the roof of the depot, using an army surplus blankets as our parachute, and letting our legs buckle under us when we hit the ground. And like Dad had taught us real parachutists do. Hit the ground like Dad taught us real parachutists do. We'd put a piece of scrap metal or a penny, if we were feeling extravagant, on the railroad tracks right before the train came. After the train had roared away, the massive wheels churning, we'd run to get our newly flattened, hot, and shiny piece of metal. The thing we liked to do most was going exploring in the desert. We'd get up at dawn, my favorite time, when the shadows were long and purple, and you still had the whole day ahead of you. Sometimes Dad went with us, and we'd march through the sagebrush military style, with Dad calling out orders in a sing-song chant. Up, 2, 3, 4, and then we'd stop and do push-ups, and Dad would hold out his arms so we could do pull-ups on it. Mostly Brian and I went exploring by ourselves. That desert was filled with all sorts of amazing treasures. We had moved to Battle Mountain because of the gold in the area, but the desert also had tons of other mineral deposits. There was silver, copper, and uranium, and barite, which Dad said oil drilling rigs used. Mom and Dad could tell what kind of minerals and ore were in the ground from the color of the rock and soil. They taught us what to look for. Iron was the red rocks, copper and the green, and there was so much turquoise. Nuggets and even big chunks of it laying in the desert floor. Brian and I could fill our pockets with it until the weight practically pulled our pants down. You could also find arrowheads and fossils in old bottles that had turned deep purple from lying under the broiling sun for years. You could find the sun-parched skulls of coyotes and empty turquoise shells and the rattles and shed skins of rattlesnakes. And you could find great big bullfrogs that had stayed in the sun too long and were completely dried up and light as a piece of paper. On Sunday night, if Dad had money, we'd go to the Owl Club for dinner. The Owl Club was world famous according to the sign, where a hoot owl wearing a chef's hat pointed the way to the entrance. Off to one side was a room with rows of slot machines that were constantly clicking and ticking and flashlights. Mom said that the slot players were hypnotized, and Dad said they were damn fools. Never play the slots, Dad told us. They're for suckers who only rely on luck. Dad knew all about statistics, and he explained how casinos stacked the odds against slot players. When Dad gambled, he preferred poker and pool, games of skill, not chance. Whoever coined the phrase "a man's got to play in the hand that he was dealt" was most certainly one piss-poor bluffer, Dad said. The Owl Club had a bar where groups of men with sunburned necks huddled together over beers and cigarettes. They all knew Dad, and whenever he walked in, they insulted him in a loud, funny way that it was meant to be friendly. "This joint must be going to hell in a handbasket if they're letting the sorry-ass characters like you," they'd shout. "Hell, my presence here has a positively elevating effect compared to you mangy coyotes," Dad would yell back. They'd all throw their head back and laugh, and slap one another between the shoulder blades. We always sat at one of the red booths, Such good manners, the waitress would exclaim, because Mom and Dad may say sir and ma'am and yes please and thank you. They're damn smart, too, Dad would declare. Finest damn kids that ever walked the planet. And we'd smile and order hamburgers and chili dogs and milkshakes and big plates of onion rings that glistened with hot grease. The waitress brought the food to the table and poured the milkshakes from a sweating metal container into our glasses. There was always some left over, so she kept the container on the table for us to finish. Looks like you hit the jackpot and got something extra, she'd say with a wink. We'd always left the Owl Club so stiff that we could hardly walk. Let's waddle home, kids, Dad would say. The Barrett mine where Dad worked had a commissary, and the mine owner deducted our bill and rent for the depot out of Dad's paycheck every month. At the beginning of each week, we went to the commissary, Jesus, and brought home bags and bags of food. Mom said only people brainwashed by advertising bought prepared food such as SpaghettiOs and TV dinners. She bought the basics: sacks of flour or cornmeal, powdered milk, onions, potato, 20 bags of rice or pinto beans, salt, sugar, yeast for making bread, cans of Jack Mackerel, and canned ham or a fat slab of bologna, and for dessert, cans of sliced peaches. Mom didn't like cooking much. Why spend the afternoon making a meal that would be gone in an hour, she'd ask us, when in the same amount of time I can do a painting that will last forever. So once a week or so, she'd fix a big cast iron vat of something like fish and rice, or usually beans. We'd all sort through the beans together, picking out the rocks. And then Mom would soak them overnight, boil them the next day with an old ham bone to give them flavor. And for the entire week, we'd have beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If the beans started going bad, we'd just put extra spice in them, like the Mexicans at the LBJ apartments always did. We bought so much food that we never had much money come payday. One payday, Dad owed the mine company 11 cents. He thought I was funny and told them to put it on his tab. Dad almost never went out drinking at night like he used to. He stayed home with us, and after dinner, the whole family stretched out on the benches and on the floor of the depot and read the dictionary in the middle of the room so we kids could look up the words we didn't know. Sometimes I discussed the definitions with Dad, and if we didn't agree with the dictionary writers had said, we sat down and wrote letters to the publishers. They'd write back defending their position, and which would prompt an even longer letter from Dad, and if they replied again, so would he, until we stopped hearing from the dictionary people. Mom read everything: Charles Dickens, William Faulkner, Henry Miller, Pearl Buck. She even read James Michener apologetically, saying she knew it wasn't great literature, but she couldn't help herself. Dad preferred science and math books, biographies, and history. We kids read whatever Mom brought home from her weekly trips to the library. Brian read thick adventure books, ones written by guys like Zane Grey. Lori especially loved Freddie the Pig, and all of the Oz books. I liked the Laura Ingalls Wilder stories and the We Were There series about kids who lived at great historical moments. And my very favorite was Black Beauty. Occasionally on those nights when we were all reading together, a train would thunder by, shaking the house and rattling the windows. The noise was thunderous, but after we'd all been there a while, we didn't even hear it. Mom enrolled us in St. Mary's S. Black Elementary School. A long, low building with asphalt playground that turned gooey in the hot sun. My second grade class was filled with the children of miners and gamblers, scabby-kneed and dustied from playing in the desert, with uneven home scissored bangs. Our teacher, Miss Page, was a small, pinched woman, given to sudden rages and savage thrashings with her ruler. Mom and Dad had already taught me nearly everything Miss Page was teaching me. Since I wanted the other kids to like me, I didn't raise my hand all the time the way I had in Blythe. Dad accused me of coasting. Sometimes he made me do my arithmetic homework in binary numbers because he said I needed to be challenged. Before class, I'd have to recopy it into Arabic numbers, but one day I didn't have time, so I turned in the assignment in its binary version. "What's this?" Miss Page asked. She pressed her lips together as she studied the circles and lines that covered my paper, then looked up at me suspiciously. "Is this a joke?" I tried to explain to her about the binary numbers and how they were a system that computers used, and how Dad said they were far superior to other numeric systems. Miss Page stared at me. "It wasn't the assignment," she said impatiently. "She made me stay late to redo the homework." I didn't tell Dad because I knew he'd come into the school and debate Miss Page about the virtues of various numeric systems. Lots of other kids lived in our neighborhood, which was known as the Tracks, and after school we all played together. We played red light, green light, tag, football, Red Rover, or nameless games that involved running hard, keeping up with the pack, and not crying if you fell down. All the families who lived around the tracks were tight on cash. Some were tighter than others, but all of us kids were scrawny and sunburned, and wore faded shorts and raggedy shirts and sneakers with holes or no shoes at all. What was most important to us was who ran the fastest and whose daddy wasn't a wimp. My dad was not only not a wimp, he came out to play with the gang, running alongside us, tossing us up in the air and wrestling against the entire pack without getting hurt. Kids from the tracks came knocking on our door, and when I answered, they asked, "Can your dad come out and play?" Lori, Brian, and I, and even Maureen, would go pretty much anywhere and do just about anything we wanted. Mom believed that children shouldn't be burdened with a lot of rules and restrictions. Dad whipped us with his belt, but never out of anger, and only if we backtalked or disobeyed a direct order, which was rare. The only rule was that we had to come home when the streetlights went on, and use your common sense, Mom said. She felt it was good for kids to do what they wanted because they learned a lot from their mistakes. Mom was not one of those fussy mothers who got upset when you came home dirty or played in the mud or fell or cut yourself. She said that people should get things like that out of their systems while they're young. Once an old nail ripped my thigh while I was climbing over a fence at my friend Carla's house. Carla's mother thought I should go to the hospital for stitches and a tetanus shot. Nothing but a minor flesh wound, Mom declared after studying the deep gash. People these days run to the hospital every time they skin their knees, she added. We're becoming a nation of sissies. With that, she sent me back out to play. Some of the rocks I found while I was exploring out in the desert were so beautiful that I could not bear the idea of leaving them there, so I started a collection. Brian helped me with it, and together we found garnets and granite and obsidian and Mexican crazy lace and more turquoise. Dad made necklaces for Mom out of all of that turquoise. We discovered large sheets of mica that you could pound into powder and then rub all your body so you'd shimmer under the Nevada sun, as if you were coated with diamonds. Lots of times, Brian and I thought we'd found gold, and we'd stagger home with an entire bucket full of sparkling nuggets, but they were always iron pirate, fool's gold. And some of it, Dad said we should keep, because especially good quality for fool's gold. My favorite rocks to find were the geodes, which Mom said came from the volcanoes that had erupted to form the Tuscarora Mountains millions of years ago, during the Miocene period. From the outside, geodes looked like boring round rocks, but when you broke them open with a chisel and hammer, the insides were hollow like a cave, and the walls were covered with glittering white quartz crystals or sparkling purple amethyst. I kept my rock collection behind the house next to Mom's piano, which was getting a little weathered. Lori and Brian and I would use the rocks to decorate the graves of our pets that had died, or the dead animals we found and decided to get a proper burial. I also held rock sales. I didn't have many customers because I charged hundreds of dollars for a piece of flint. In fact, the only person who ever bought one of my rocks was Dad. He came out behind the house one day with a pocket full of change, and was startled when he saw the price tags I'd taped to each rocks. "Honey, your inventory might move a little faster if you dropped your prices," he said. I explained that all of my rocks were incredibly valuable, and I'd rather keep them than sell them for less than they were worth. Dad gave me his crooked smile. "Sounds like you've thought this through particularly well," he said. He told me that he'd had his heart on buying a particular piece of rose quartz, but he didn't have the $600 I was charging, so I cut the price down to $500 and let him have it on credit. Brian and I loved to go to the dump. We looked for treasures among the discarded stoves and refrigerators, the broken furniture and stacks of bald tires. We'd chase after the desert rats that lived in the wrecked cars, or caught tadpoles and frogs in the scum-topped pond. Buzzards circled overhead, and the air was filled with dragonflies the size of small birds. There were no trees to speak of in Battle Mountain, but one corner of the dump had huge piles of railroad ties and rotting lumber that were great for climbing and carving your initials on. We called it the woods. Toxic and hazardous wastes were stored in another corner of the dump, where you could find old batteries, oil drums, paint cans, and bottles with skulls and crossbones. Brian and I decided that some of this stuff would make for a neat scientific experiment. So we filled up a couple of boxes with the different bottles and jars, and took them to an abandoned shed that we named our laboratory. At first, we mixed things together, hoping they would explode, but nothing happened. So I decided that we should conduct an experiment to see if any of the other stuff was flammable. The next day after school, we came back to the laboratory with a box of Dad's matches. We unscrewed the lids of some of the jars and dropped in a match, and still nothing happened. So we mixed a batch of what Brian called nuclear fuel, pouring different liquids into a can, and when I tossed in the match, the cone of flame shot up with a whoosh, like a jet afterburner. Brian and I were knocked to our feet, and when we stood up, one of the walls was on fire. I yelled to Brian that we had to get out of there, but he was throwing sand at the fire, saying that we had to put it out or we'd get in trouble. The flames were spreading towards the door, eating up that dry old wood in no time. I kicked a board of the back wall and squeezed through. When Brian didn't follow, I ran up the street calling for help. I saw Dad walking home from work, and we ran back to the shack. Dad kicked in more of the wall and pulled Brian out, coughing. I thought Dad would be furious, but he wasn't. He was sort of quiet. We stood on the street, watching flames devour the shack. Dad had an arm wrapped around each of us. He said it was an incredible coincidence that we happened to be walking by. And then he pointed to the top of the fire, where snapping yellow flames dissolved into an invisible, shimmery heat that made the desert beyond seem to waver, like a mirage. Dad told us that zone was known in physics as the boundary between turbulence and order. It's a place where no rules apply, or at least they haven't figured them out yet, he said. You got a little too close to it today.
I love you.